Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to build your strategic playbook for funding impactful research on reducing youth inequality. Look, if you're a researcher trying to secure support from the William T. Grant Foundation for the 2026 cycle, you already know how rigorous and competitive this process is. So we're going to break down their official application guide, highlight exactly what's changed for 2026, and help you position your proposal to actually win.
We've got a really clear roadmap for today. Focus and priority dimensions, eligibility, major versus officers grants, the letter of inquiry, and finally, those strict 2026 deadlines.
All right, Section 1, Focus and Priority Dimensions. Let's look at the target demographics.
Okay, the absolute baseline rule here is that your research has to relate to the outcomes of young people between the ages of 5 and 25 right here in the United States. This isn't just a suggestion, it is a hard, strict filter. Your study absolutely needs to address academic, social, behavioral, or economic outcomes within the specific age bracket and geography.
Now, let's explicitly contrast what gets funded versus what doesn't. The Foundation is looking for descriptive or intervention studies that actually test responses to inequality. They want to see specific programs, policies, or practices. They believe we've got to move beyond just proving that inequality exists, so they generally will not fund studies that solely document its causes. And pay close attention to this, it's a huge rule change for 2026. They will absolutely not fund studies primarily focused on physical health outcomes like clinical trials.
Your research also has to hit very specific dimensions of inequality: race, ethnicity, economic standing, sexual or gender minority status, language minority status, or immigrant origins. Now, you might be wondering, what if my research focuses on something else, like disability status? Well, the Foundation is clear that it must be studied in intersection with one of these 6 primary dimensions if you want it funded.
Beyond those specific dimensions, they have a deep, special interest in uprooting systemic racism and the structural foundations of inequality. In their own words, they're looking for research that shifts the focal point of change away from trying to fix individuals and instead focuses on altering macro-level social institutions to, quote, dislodge the deep roots of inequality. Basically, they want structural, transformative solutions.
Moving right along to Section 2, Eligibility Details, and who can actually apply.
The crucial point here is that the money flows strictly to tax-exempt organizations. The Foundation does not write checks to individual researchers. That said, they are super proactive about who they want to see applying. They heavily encourage proposals from historically underrepresented institutions like HBCUs, Hispanic-serving institutions, and tribal colleges, as well as projects led by researchers of color.
Listen up, because here's a major new rule for 2026. You are only allowed to submit 1 application per cycle as a principal investigator. You literally can't hedge your bets by throwing in a major grant and an officer's grant in the same cycle anymore. You have to pick your absolute strongest project and fully commit.
Section 3, Major versus Officers Grants. It is time to choose your track.
Let's break down the 2 options. Major research grants are the big ones. We're talking between $100,000 and $600,000 over 2 to 3 years. But it is a multi-step marathon. You start with a letter of inquiry, and if you make the cut, you're invited to submit a full 25-page proposal. Officers' research grants are much more surgical. They're smaller, $25,000 to $50,000 over 1 to 2 years. But the beauty is, they are awarded entirely on the merit of that initial letter of inquiry. There's no second-round proposal.
Now, let's manage some expectations. Check out that tiny 8% sliver. Because of historic highs in application volume, that is the highly competitive historical rate of LOIs that actually get invited to submit a full major grant proposal. And honestly, from that 8%, only about 20% of those full proposals ultimately get funded. So yeah, the competition is incredibly steep.
Think the smaller grants are an easier bet? Well, not quite. Officers' grants are just as competitive, with only about 6 to 8% of submissions actually getting funding approval straight from the LOI. This means your initial 5-page pitch has to be absolutely flawless no matter which track you go down. Which brings us to Section 4, the letter of inquiry. Let's dig into this 5-page mini proposal.
Your 5-page project narrative has to meticulously follow these 3 core steps to win over the review panel. You can't just use vague buzzwords like at-risk youth.
First, you have to prove that academic, social, behavioral, or economic outcomes are unequal. Second, you must tie that clearly to one of those priority dimensions, like race or economic standing. And third, you have to explain exactly how testing your specific program, policy, or practice is going to help us understand how to reduce that inequality.
A really crucial part of making that case is defining your theory of change. You can't just throw a program at a problem and measure what happens. You need to provide a rock-solid theoretical and empirical rationale explaining exactly why the policy you're studying is going to equalize outcomes between groups. Basically, you have to connect the dots conceptually before the foundation is going to pay you to connect them empirically.
There is a huge logistical trap here that catches a lot of researchers totally off guard. While both tracks require that narrative, if you're applying for an officer's grant, you absolutely must have a full line-item budget and coordinate your institutional sign-off prior to submitting the LOI. Trust me, you don't want to wait until 4 p.m. on deadline day to realize you need your dean's signature to get your funding.
And finally, Section 5, 2026 deadlines and your calendar. Go ahead and circle these dates because they are strictly enforced. Cycle 1 is January 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Cycle 2 is July 29th. If you submit a major grant LOI, you're going to hear back about an invitation for a full proposal in about 9 weeks. If you submit an officer's grant, your final funding decision arrives in about 14 weeks. Just keep in mind, the whole journey for a major grant from the initial LOI to a final board funding decision is a 10 to 12-month process.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this one essential thought. Before you spend weeks drafting a massive proposal for the 2026 cycle, ask yourself honestly, does your research merely describe inequality, or does it actively test responses to dislodge its deep roots? The William T. Grant Foundation isn't looking to fund just another paper detailing how bad things are. They want to fund the structural solutions that actually make things better. So are you ready to answer that call? And what structural roots will your research pull up?